companies like Intel, Microsoft, and Google have increased their presence here. It's a strong presence right now to get ready for that boom that's expected to come.
Welcome to the Ground Investigation podcast. This episode is all about senior geotechnical engineers shaping the future of renewables and critical infrastructure in booming Columbus, Ohio, and the Midwest. Joining me from Columbus is Mike Kennedy, a senior geotechnical engineer at Jacobs. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
More than welcome. So as you build Jacobs' regional presence, what makes Columbus and Ohio so compelling for a geotechnical engineering career right now, especially in the renewables and infrastructure project area?
Yeah, there's a lot of growth in Ohio right now. There's a big push and move with companies coming here, especially to central Ohio. But Ohio is kind of outside of the realm of a lot of natural disasters. So we're seeing a lot of influx of companies from, typically you'd see in California, some of the Silicon Valley type work. A lot of them are moving out here. And so that's bringing a lot of market, a lot of increase in residential demands and infrastructure demands and, pushes, all across the board. And so Ohio's, really, they proactively ramped up, attempts to increase budget, increase, the workforce to be able to handle that need. So it's a good time to be an engineer of any division, really, in Ohio. A lot of market growth.
Excellent. So you say that because all the companies are sort of moving over there, that's creating, I suppose, industrial projects, residential projects, and then there could be power projects on top of that as well to power everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's, it's started, been a long time running. There's infrastructure projects increasing. Brent Spence Bridge is a major project, and Southwest Ohio, Cincinnati, Ohio. That's been a project in the works for, I think, 2 decades or more now. And it finally started rolling a couple years ago. And it's a big push to increase the economic drive and the bottleneck that was there previously. So that'll be a big improvement, economically for Ohio. And then companies like Intel, Microsoft, and Google have increased their presence here, as well as some other industrial type companies. Anduril came out, and that was a big move. And so that's creating a lot of demand. And when companies that large come, they need a lot of workforce, and of course that increases demand on our highway systems, our conveyance, water utilities, and plants and everything. So a lot of those are popping up with pretty much every municipality. So it's a strong presence right now to get ready for that boom that's expected to come.
Okay, I was there probably about 6 weeks or so ago, so I can see that there's kind of a lot of building work going on when I was there. So in relation to these companies, larger companies moving in and kind of putting a bit more pressure on the requirements for infrastructure and housing, industrial projects, how does that affect the kind of geotechnical engineer skill set required to sort of fulfill, the geotechnical and ground investigation side of all of this?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's just a big demand on the available, uh, staff and the firms here. Jacobs has a global presence, and then, we team with, all of the local firms, and, it's, geotech is a small discipline in the grand scheme of civil engineering. There's not a lot of us out there. We always say it's a small world. And so it seems like we all work together on a lot of the same projects. And so with that brings a lot of experience and experience demands, both from the entry level, trying to get, folks on board to build up for the long term, to be able to do that work, as well as experienced folks to be able to drive these projects from the start. And so with infrastructure, it's bringing a lot of increased demand for a lot of interchange improvements. And so there's a big demand on, transportation. And then, on the industrial side, that's a little bit of a new market for me. As far as, these data centers are, large manufacturing facilities, and, the renewable sites, those are popping up a lot. We're seeing solar farms in quite a lot of areas. And so that's for me, a new market of work, but, geotech's going to be needed for all of those. And so there's a big demand for us to be able to handle the growth. And it's always, you can pull people from other states and locations, but having that local presence and local knowledge goes a long way in geotech, understanding the conditions, the typical practice, what the contractors are used to, and you can tailor, our work to that to build a better product.
Yeah, definitely. You think it's probably going to be intrinsic to get people from other states to fulfill what's essentially going to be the booming market, but of course there's going to be a lot more requirements for geotechnical engineers, structural engineers, civil engineers.
Mhm. Yeah, there is a big push, across pretty much all STEM fields, actually. There's, we see a lot of, movement, in between firms, especially, post COVID. There's a lot of move, and that's still going on. And it doesn't do, the community, the state of Ohio a lot of good, or or the Midwest, Indiana, Michigan, all of them. If people are just moving, from company to company within the current states, that doesn't increase our workforce to be able to handle that demand. And so when you can encourage folks from other states, that may have, different growth or slower markets, to come here and move to Ohio, and show that it has a lot to offer, that increases, our ability to be able to handle what's coming, and what's actively, in progress. So yeah, there's actually, a group, Jobs Ohio, but they're doing a big push to encourage companies to recruit from out of state. And I think that's a good direction the state's going in.
Definitely.
Struggling to find top geotechnical and geoenvironmental talent? You could use a generalist recruiter, or you could use a specialist. At Geo Expert Search, we place experts where they belong. Across the UK, USA, Australia, and New Zealand. No highways, no bridges, no structures. Just geotechnical and geoenvironmental. Now and forever. Geo Expert Search. Finding the right people for the right roles with no wasted time. Visit geoexpertsearch.com to learn more.
What are the kind of typical states that, to fulfill the requirements, I suppose, for Ohio, Columbus, that you were generally going towards to do that?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, from what I've seen personally, folks that move to Ohio are already used to the Midwest culture. I mean, every region of the states has their own, uh, you know, you know, tendencies, and you get accustomed to that. I know we had a guy recently move here from Hawaii, which is quite the distance. But he had roots in Indiana, and so, very similar. So I think the typical what you see is folks that are, used to or familiar with, the Midwest life a little bit, but trying to grow on that. There's efforts to get them, from anywhere, to help out.
Okay. So if the audience are finding these insights valuable, just remember to like the episode and share it with your network. So with your comprehensive background from the hands-on lab, drilled rig time to design, water resources, how has the broad experience, including foundation types and proficiency in geotechnical software, prepared you for today's complex projects, particularly in renewables?
Yeah, I started off, entry level geotech in Central Ohio, and the best thing that I was afforded was the opportunity to go out in the field and work in the lab, both behind the drill rig and construction. Throughout those first, developmental years, I'll say, even even up to the first 10 or so, that gives you a lot of experience to be able to handle the design and understand what you're working through. In that, it goes a long way. A lot of my experience is in the dam market, and so getting out on site to be able to look at that construction and understand the compaction efforts, for example. You can write that up and spec it out all day, but until you actually get out there and see the difficulties and what works with the type of soils, um, really helps improve how you develop those plan sets, and directions for the contractor, especially once you get into coordinating with them, through the bid process, and RFI questions, and during construction. Without getting that field experience, you're really at a disadvantage. And so I was glad to have had that at the start of my career.
Yeah, you get, I mean, I did recruitment, I worked in the industry myself, but certainly see now, and I've said it on the podcast many times, but lots of people now want to come into the industry, go straight into the office, or they don't want to work away from home, which is a real problem, isn't it? Because you have that hands-on experience to stand by a rig, to speak to the drillers, is going to be very useful for you for later on, at least for managing, at least, and be able to get on and get things done.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I've interviewed a few candidates and worked with others, and had some others that I'm just connected to professionally, and they've looked for advice on going into career decisions of how much field work and what should I be open to that. And I always encourage that strong yes, whether it's drilling the lab or construction, especially construction, that it goes a long way. But it, like any state in any geology, Ohio's got a lot, from the southeast, in Appalachia area, to lacustrine, conditions in the northwest around the Great Lakes. And so getting out there and seeing that, helps tailor, how you use the software and the models, and understanding how that might behave. And you really can't build your analysis without seeing that material and working with it physically in your hands. So it goes a long way for sure.
It does. I think it's one of the most enjoyable sides of it personally, to get out to different sites, different geologies, see what the actual, comes out the drilling rig in terms of samples. And it's a great way of doing it. Being trapped in the office, for some people, it's just not for some people.
Yeah,
It's actually right to be out on site, for maybe go down like the project management route, that sort of thing.
Mm.
And being stuck in an office 5 days a week is probably the worst thing. Working with some people.
I feel like a lot of us get into geotech for the field work. You get a touch for it, and any chance I get to go recon a landslide, or visit a dam, or get out and see some testing for drilled shafts or driven piles. You jump on it, and as you move along your career, you get that a little less, and so any opportunity you get, you go for it. And then I would encourage, we do it here, and every firm I've worked with, the senior folks go out, we always bring the younger staff with us, because you never know when you get to see it again. You don't always get to go out on site, depending on the type of projects you work on. So any chance I get, I'll raise my hand to go out in the field.
Yeah, no, that was me. I was always out in the field. Apart from when I got a job in a consultancy, and then it was kind of half the time, maybe a little bit more in the office. But staring at a computer screen all day wasn't fun, even though now, of course, I'm a geotechnical recruiter, and all I do is I'm staring at a computer screen. So it's kind of gone full circle, and I'm back in the same position.
Yeah.
So if you're enjoying this podcast, please subscribe to the podcast for more expert insights. So demand for geotechnical expertise is soaring, especially in renewables. So we spoke a little bit earlier on about your interest in the experience and knowledge in this field. So what makes renewable energy projects interesting to geotechnical engineers, such as solar and wind, and what unique challenges do these projects present for a geotechnical engineer looking to move into the area?
Yeah, I mean, it's like for me, I haven't done a lot with a lot of renewable sites. It's a focus of a lot of projects today, of course. Sustainable movements. But renewable sites like solar farms, or wind, or anything, they're it's a new type of the structure and requirement and site characterization of the demands of what those facilities need from either utility or prep standpoint. And I don't, a lot of geotechs, some, really focus in on a certain niche, whether it's, dams or transportation or water. And so this brings out a whole new one, or whether it's vertical. And so this brings a new breadth of experience, to the market as that increases, and understanding what tolerances they can live with, and types of demands they have on the foundations. I know we saw one. It's still out in the bid standpoint, but it was on a site that was heavy karst, and so making sure that we could that's like any other site trying to build on karst, having those demands, and so this is just a new way to approach that and look at it. So it's just knowing a new market brings something different and some variety, which I think is good, and so I hope to gain experience on that. It's a growing boom everywhere, so it'll be good to keep up.
So in terms of what do you think the kind of the typical geotechnical engineer is in terms of their previous experience, transferable skills? Because if you've got someone who's always done, say, commercial house building, that sort of thing, or supporting that, who do you think would fare best if they were just kind of focused on renewables, whether it was solar, wind, obviously the cables, that sort of thing?
That's a good question. I think there would be a lot of similarities and transportation or vertical. You're going to be focused on site development and foundations. Anywhere from deep to probably a lot of shallow foundations, depending on what type of renewable you're going after. And so the water market may not touch into that as much. Depending on what types of facilities, how large you're working with. I think a lot of those could cross over. But probably a lot with more of the vertical side. You're going to have enough variety in that you'll be ready to address that, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Okay. So, as someone attracting new talent, what's your perspective on the current landscape in geotechnical engineering, especially with your observations about universities reducing relevant courses, which of course is the same in the UK. I think it generally a global thing. Lots of universities seem to be taking away courses. Sort of high skill seems to be doing less A levels, what we would call it here. But yeah, what's your take on that?
Yeah, there's definitely been a fluctuation. I know some of the local universities here, lost, they have their geotech program, but they lost it at the graduate level, for their master's programs. Temporarily, they've built it back, but that's a result of professors retiring and not having support built in already to keep that going. And there's and when you lose that, you lose interest of the students coming out sticking with geotech once they're exposed to it. A lot of them, I have a lot of involvement with ASCE, and what we're seeing is even at the grade school level, kids are coming out deciding what they want to be pretty young, 10, 11, 12. And that sometimes that sticks, and of course kids change often. But going into college, they usually know what kind of engineer, if they're going into civil engineering, they want to be pretty early. And so if they don't get into those soils classes and foundations early enough, they sometimes select the more attractive ones. Either they got an environmental pool or structural pool or construction. Those are the big I guess the flashier ones that they see going in, they get a lot of exposure to, and the geotech is kind of that extra class. So when you lose that level of professors and level of programs that are offer that early on, you have less of those individuals coming out. And so yeah, I think there's still relatively a small pool of geotech engineers, at the younger level coming out of school. It's starting to tick up, I think, with a lot of programs, at least what I see locally, a lot of them building up their programs. So I think it's heading in the right direction, but it's definitely a push by the industry as a whole just to get more engineering out there. And then each discipline is trying to grow that, of course.
If someone was kind of going through the college process now and they're thinking of maybe, specializing a bit more structural or pure civils, what could you say to them to put them back to the kind of the good side, the geotechnical engineering specific side?
One thing that stuck with me I going into school, I'm an example. I started and wanted to be a bridge engineer. That's what I came into it for. And then I got a TA job and did well in the geotech class with my professor. And he became a mentor for me, and I got to work in the lab for him and do some of the assignment grades once I got further along in the curriculum. And getting that exposure really helped. But one thing he always said is geotech is kind of the more the art of the civil engineering, or subjective. It's not black and white, follow the code. And every discipline can get into that. There's innovation at every level, structural, roadway, and at each of them. But geotech, that was another. He also had another saying: put 100 geotechs in a room, and you get 100 different designs, and they could all be right. And so I think that's intriguing. And once you dive into that, you see there's a lot of relationships and complexity with structural. Geotech and structural engineers, we go hand in hand, and so you can really get, if you gravitate kind of to both of those, you can get that exposure for it with geotech with both. I feel so. I think there's a lot more to offer once you dive into it and see.
Yeah, that's a good point. There's a lot more variation, of course, in geology than there is in tempered steel.
Yeah.
The parameters a lot more. So of course, in that area. So the post-COVID era has seen a clear preference for remote work, which I see on a regular basis. So, but yet geotechnical engineering is inherently hands-on, or can be. How are firms balancing field work with evolving employee preferences through flexible work environments?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a nature of, going into it, understanding the field demands. But a lot of companies are trying to keep that hybrid, flexible model, realizing that, people's lives, even before COVID had that need to have, that balance and being able to, come in a little late one day because they need to for something, or they're not feeling great, to come into the office. And so having that hybrid model of 2 or 3 days in the office, but geotech, sometimes that requires field work. And so going into, you just have to know you got to get out there. And that's, you could, those assignments may not, maybe long term, maybe less, but there's still that flexibility. So, what I've seen with companies, the ones I've worked for, they've offered that as best they can since COVID. Um, and just, you got to be a little more, uh, uh, proactive, and reactive with, the field work, what those demands are, to cover the geologists that are planning to be out there every day, or, to come in and fill in for them, or you have a additional project that requires the PE to go out there. And so you just got to realize and, kind of shift everybody around based on their skill sets, and to give them that balance. So it's definitely a challenge, and trying to hire and communicate that there's still that flexibility, but you still got to have you know, that field work included.
Yeah, to be honest, it's one good thing that come out of COVID, normalizing a little bit more hybrid work, allowing people,
Mm.
because I mean, some people take a role where they're an hour and 20 minutes away, commute each way, and that over an entire week, or think about it over a month, it's
Mm.
it's a long amount of time.
Yeah.
It's the only, I suppose, non-renewable resource that we have, really, isn't it? It's time. We can always earn more money, but we cannot create any more time at this point anyway. Maybe in the future, but not for now. So how is your company adapting to hybrid work? Share your experience, and do not forget to like and subscribe this podcast. For those eager to tackle the industry challenges, what career trajectory or impact can a senior geotechnical engineer expect in a rapidly growing firm involved in the renewable sector and building a presence in a key region like Ohio?
Yeah. So, I mean, going into that, there's a lot of, leadership opportunity, trying going into a senior role, it requires that technical ability, but also, the project management and team management, being able to work with, you know, the staff you have, call them, resource leveling to where they can handle their other projects and, demands, for my current role at Jacobs, we work across the states and have different folks in different time zones, and trying to coordinate that schedule. And then, there's demanding projects, in every market. And so the senior role, you can kind of go down two different paths, either the, project, team leadership path, or just pure technical. And so I think as you go into that, you got to know what you like, what you want exposure to, or if you want to grow in one or the other, and make sure you set yourself up for success, knowing your skill sets, and go into it at the right pace. Um, and before you go into there, building that, under a more senior engineer, and having that, foundation of building those abilities. I was a PM before I jumped into this role, and that definitely went a long way in being able to meet that demand.
So, and this is something, again, I would hear, and I've kind of learned from dealing in the American market, the kind of seller doer mentality. So where you need someone who's technically there, but you also need someone to have the leadership, communication skills, which I always think is kind of left brain, right brain, and you need to combine that, which is certainly fewer people. How many do you think actually cross over like that? Because sometimes people are brilliantly technical, but their comm skills is just not what you would expect or want from someone in a leadership position.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say it's got it, close to 50-50. I work with a lot of individuals that are, 20-25 years experience, and they've stayed technical because that's what they love and enjoy and they're great at. And we tap them for their input. and they do well with it, but they do not like dealing with the contracts and the, some of the schedule demands and coordination that takes, and that's perfectly great. But you need both in order to have a successful project. Um, and then on, contrary, there's plenty of, folks that go into it that, they're not so great technically, but they can deliver a project like no other. And so recognize that skill set. And, usually, you're heavy on one and the other. You do have a lot of folks that can do both, and that those are great people to have on the team. So it's just a matter of what I think, going in as a young engineer, if you want to explore and find out which path you want, take every opportunity and get a mentor early on to work with. I had some great ones when I started, from my supervisor and senior engineers that I worked with early on. Immediately from year one, got involved in understanding, the, client requests, and, understanding their scope and building the budget and, the financials, and, but also diving in with every technical opportunity to, push and be able to do the analysis. And so that I would encourage that for anyone, looking to go down the path of, senior engineer or management, or, to be pure technical, is open your eyes to see where your best fit is, because you may not know until you experience it.
Definitely. So do you mentor yourself currently? I presume you mentor some perhaps more junior colleagues.
Yeah, I do. They're in other offices right now. We're trying to grow the presence here, but got some other folks that mentor, currently on the projects, to give them exposure both to design build work and more technical work, to grow that. And then in the past, in my previous roles, the way we always did it is we had a number of senior engineers and project managers, and at one time I think that we had three of us, and then we had three very new, 1 year or less, entry level engineers, and so we all each took one and tried to expose them, to each market, if you will, of geotech, whether it's transportation or dams or facilities. And that mentorship, I think, benefited them well, and us well, as to grow the team, to have that breadth of experience. And to you always want to encourage replacement of your role, for as you move on. You want someone to fill those shoes, and then to do it better. So um, getting involved in mentorship, both as a mentee and mentor, I think that's vital for companies.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it's imperative. I think some companies can get into a position where there's almost too much work, and it becomes a nice to have rather than a need to have. But I think to be successful long term,
Yeah.
you have to pass the knowledge on. There has to be some kind of process to get that done, because it can be too easily forgotten, I think. So
Mhm.
what kind of environment encourages career acceleration and professional growth in the industry, would you say?
Diversity of clients and markets, I'll say, and then having, just back to that mentorship, getting, having opportunities to go in the field or to work with different groups. Currently in my role, the geotech, we're lucky in that, you don't just get pigeonholed into working only on transportation projects. And so, getting to work on those and water and other disciplines, they all need geotech, um, gives that career growth opportunity, and kind of opens up a lot of windows for it. There's more paths to select from that.
Definitely. So do you think it can be quite harmful, because sometimes people do get pigeonholed, of course, and they just focus on one particular industry, but longer term, that's perhaps not as good, not as interesting as well, I would not imagine.
It could be, yeah, but I mean, if it depends. If you have that niche and that's what you enjoy and that's all that you want to do. I know several geotech engineers that they focus only on environmental projects, and that's their passion. Similarly for dams, and so I think it comes down to the individual, and getting, knowing, what you don't want to get burnt out. That's the biggest thing we all want to avoid, either from having the same projects and same routine, or just simply doing too much of one thing, and then you become disinterested as you go along, and that really impacts the quality of your work, um, both, directly on your production and on your mental ability to handle it. So I think it comes down to the individual, but it can be a detriment if you don't have that passion for one specific, area.
Excellent. So Thank you very much, Mike. This has been an insightful discussion to geotechnical engineering's vital role in shaping our sustainable future, significant growth in Columbus, Ohio, and challenges facing our profession. Thank you for sharing your expertise. Is there anywhere which you would like for people to connect with yourself or learn more about Jacobs or anything else in the region at all?
Yeah, I mean, LinkedIn is the best location, I'd say. I'm on there. Jacobs is on there. So yeah, please feel free to reach out.
Excellent. That concludes another Ground Investigation podcast. If this conversation resonated, particularly if you're a geotechnical engineer in Columbus, Ohio, looking to impact renewable energy, then get in touch and we can have a conversation. See my LinkedIn profile, show notes. It will be in the show notes, and let me know your thoughts on this particular podcast. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the episode. Mike, thank you very much for your time. I do appreciate it.
Yep. Thanks for having me.